Hi, I'm Pradeepa and today I'm going to show you how to paint this simple crocus painting in watercolor. Let's do this. For this painting you will need magenta, permanent rose, violet, yellow, green gold, ultramarine blue, hooker's green and orange. You will also need a large round size 12 brush, a size 8 brush and a size 2 round brush. You'll also need two water containers, one for dirty and one for clean. Let's get started. First, I make a big puddle of violet and also another puddle of magenta. And you want this to be more like tea or coffee. So we're going to start with the magenta and paint one petal at a time. I'm just carefully tracing out the borders based on the pencil sketch that I've drawn. And you can see that the magenta is a little bit watery. It's not very strong, but it's not very fluid either. So a weak but not very watery wash. I go into the second petal now. I paint in the whole petal and then drag it a bit downwards so as to go and meet the stem of the flower. So we're going to paint one petal at a time, and now I'm taking some violet again with my smallest brush and just dropping that violet in at the center of that petal because there are some striations, and I'm painting them violet because they almost acts like the shadow color of the petals. I'm tracing the outline too and the veins of the petals, and I'm following the directions as I see them on my reference photo. I took this reference when I went to our local botanical gardens a couple of weeks ago, and there were so many crocuses. So I'm just tracing or painting the veins on the petals. I'm also adding some darker violet at the bottom of the petal. You can see in that bottom third. That's where the petal bends and goes inside. Now I'm painting the stem of the flower with a very light violet. I'm using a darker violet now to go and define the edge as well as add some striations which mark the texture of the petal. So I'm following the direction with my brush strokes to resemble the shape and curve of the petal, and going all the way down and just shaping the bit where the petal meets the stem to make it look more natural. We're then going to paint in our next petal with quite a dark mixture of pink and violet. I'm pulling that color along the edge of the previous petal while leaving a little sliver of white, because otherwise this petal is going to bleed into the first petal we painted. We are going to paint that white border later, but after they've all dried. And I'm just pulling it all the way down to meet the stem. So once I've defined this nice dark edge of this petal that's facing sideways, I'm then going to come in and work on the petals at the back, outlining almost all three petals at the back at the same time. And I'm using a fairly thick mixture of that violet mixed with magenta. And the advantage of this is that we can get a few petals done at the same time while allowing the front petals to dry. So this is something that you'll have to decide how you want to proceed. So while we outline, and then we're going to connect each petal to the next petal, you can see that I'm using my smallest brush at this point and really taking my time to do that. I'm now mixing a mixture of ultramarine blue. And using my mid-sized brush, I'm dropping in that color because that is going to signify that this is the inside surface of the petals as opposed to the outside surface, which is our front two petals that we're seeing. And it's quite a light mixture, as you can see, and I am painting around the stamens which are on the inside of the petals. This is where it helps to have that good drawing first. And I'm using the same technique to just paint in the inside of all three petals at the same time, making sure I paint around the stamen of the flowers. Again, with my brush strokes, I'm following the direction of the petals and the way that their petal curves. It's a very dilute, watery mixture. And once I paint into the nooks and crannies, I'm using my smaller brush to drop in some of that violet and mixed with a bit of magenta, especially into the top edges of the petals, and I'm just reinforcing them, again using my brush strokes along the same direction of the petals. If you have noticed, I have left a little sliver of white between the blue and the outlines that we've drawn, just to make sure that those dark colors on the outline don't bleed into the blue. We will fill this later, but for now, I'm using the same mixture of magenta and violet to go in again to add those texture and striations on the inside of the petals. Now, the creamier your paints are, the striations will remain in place. The more watery your paint is in your small brush, it will all just mix in again. So if you want them to stay as striations, you have to make sure there's not much water in your brush. Again, you can see I'm following the direction of the petals with my brush strokes and going all the way down into the bottom with that last petal. While we're painting, there will be some softening of the paints, but we'll now go in to paint in our last end of the petal that's facing sideways. I'm using more of a magenta for this and dropping the dark violet at the top and into that top corner there, so as to show that shape of the petal a bit more. Now we're reinforcing the darks on the first petals that we painted using a mixture of pink and violet, and I'm using my middle-sized brush to add that creamy layer again, and I'm defining the edge of that petal. I'm also going and reinforcing the veins in the first petal that we painted, and also reinforcing the darks which are at the bottom of the petal, reinforcing all the darks and just gently going over with a watery brush to soften some of those veins in the petals. And I'm also going and doing a thin layer of violet over the stem. Now, deciding what I'm going to do next, actually I think we're going to go and define the edges again of the petals that we've painted at the back. You'll see that we do this quite a few times. There's at least 2 or 3 layers over the darker areas because they really need to be emphasized, and watercolor dries lighter. Now we're going over to the second flower, and we're doing pretty much the same thing that we did with our first flower. I'm just looking at my reference photo that I took and leaving out the whites and the highlights where it seems a little bit light and coming down all the way to the base of that petal, and then going over to my next petal, I'm painting it with that violet and magenta mixture, and also putting in where the striations and the veins are. I don't mind so much if these petals mix with each other, because this is more the supporting flower for the first flower. So I'm going round to the third petal, which is sort of behind all the other petals of the second flower, and therefore it's a bit more darker. I'm using more violet and more magenta there to define the edges of that petal. And we're doing a fourth petal now with that. Again, this layer has to be quite light, so we're using like a tea consistency paint, and finally putting in that fifth one, which kind of goes behind the petals of that first flower. So for the moment, I'm just leaving a sliver of white between the first flower and the second, because I don't want the petals to flow into each other and mix the two flowers together. So in the meanwhile, we're painting the stalk of the first flower with a very dilute violet, and then we are going to add that concentrated mixture of pink and violet while the petals are still wet, and define the edges a bit more. So this is almost wet and wet. I'm using my smallest paintbrush and adding in some of that striations. They will all blend in a little bit, but that's okay. And while they do that, I am going to just define the edge of that petal underneath a bit more. Now they're all quite wet still, so I'm just going to go over and define the edge of that second petal, add some more of that striations in now with a more creamy mixture. Now in summer it won't be so wet for so long, so you can adopt slightly different techniques, but this is in the winter, everything stays wet for much longer, so you have to account for that. While that's drying, we'll go over to paint a lemon yellow into the stamens of the first flower. I'm going to fill that in almost completely. The lemon yellow is going to form the first layer. We're going to come back later with a second layer. Again, I'm using my smallest brush so as to paint the lemon yellows into the stamens here. We're then going to mix in that pink and violet mixture again, and dropping that in with my smallest brush and reinforcing that petal once more of that second flower, because now it has dried a bit more. It's not going to bleed as much as it did the first time we came and painted that petal. So I'm following the striations of the direction of the striations with the by using the direction of my brush strokes, and using a flicking motion for the insides of the petals and just painting in patiently for the outsides of the petals. So you can see me flicking there, and that makes sure that it kind of ends in a taper, that striation, which is how it looks like in an actual petal. And if you're lucky and it's still slightly dry, wet, then you will find that your paint just softens just that little bit. So I'm going in and filling in, or painting in rather, that dark pink violet into that 4th petal of the second crocus. And finally I'm filling in the whites that we've left when we first painted in that crocus, because now the first crocus has dried, it's not going to bleed into that first crocus. So I can go and fill in all my slivers of white that I left at the start. Now, of course, if you have more patience and you let your petals dry in between, then you don't have to leave these slivers of white. But with it being winter and not having much patience, this is how I choose to go about it. I'm going, and this is now the third layer to really emphasize those darks on the side of the first crocus, and also just running a little bit of water over the first petal that we painted so that the striations that we put in just blend in a little bit so that they're not stark lines. And I'm also going and defining that second petal just on the side and bringing it all the way down to meet the stem of the crocus. You can see how I'm pulling it down, as well as defining the shadow on that first flower right at the bottom. So there's quite a bit of shadow at the bottom of the flower, so we have to make sure that's really nice and dark as well. So once you're happy with all the striations you've put in, you can go and just define with your paintbrush the edges of each petal. And you can see the first striations that we put on the inside of these petals is completely just merged. So we're going in with a more creamier mixture and almost using a dry brush technique now to basically, a dry brush means you have a lot less water in your brush and just pulling the paint fast over the paper. And again, it's important to bear in mind to follow the direction of the petals and the contour of the petals with the way you move your brush. Now if you make a mistake and you bring paint too far in like I did, you can always pick it up with a paper towel. Just dab it gently and it will all come, especially when it's freshly applied paint. I'm going and defining that a bit more and defining the edges of those petals and the shadows a bit more. Just putting those finishing touches really on those petals. Now we need to come back and add a bit of that orange into the left hand side of that stamen, and then we've got to use yellow to just blend that in so that there's not a harsh border between where we put that orange and the rest of the stamen. So again, putting some orange there and then getting some more yellow to just blend that in. You can see now that we've added that orange, it really brings the stamens to life. So we're going over to a second one and adding that lemon yellow to the stamens as well. By this time the petals have dried, so don't leave any white unless you want to, and just fill it in with that lemon yellow. Now I'm mixing some green, some yellow, so that hooker's green, some of that yellow, some of even sap green, and because I'll be using different shades of this as we go to paint our blades of grass. And I'm just using my largest paintbrush and almost like a dry brush, and I'm just flicking from the bottom up and filling in that gap, making them look like grass by painting in different directions. And you can see there's some yellows, there's some greens, there's some darker greens, and all of that really helps to highlight the stems of the crocuses a bit more, especially where they're so light and they start standing out a bit more. You can also go and add some greens at the top to just ensure some continuity. And you see how adding the different colors just makes the grass look more real, if you like. So I'm just adding those, and it's really up to you how much grass you want to add here. I've just added a little bit so as to highlight the grass. Now I'm adding the orange for the second stamens as well. Because they're already a little bit wet, they will just melt into the yellow that's there. And I think we're nearly there. Yes, we're done. We can take off the tape now, and you can see it's a simple but effective crocus painting. I hope you enjoyed watching.